So I want to start off the conversation today by talking a little bit about what we need to do before we start mixing in order to make our experience an enjoyable one when it comes to mixing, and in order to make the product, the end result, of the highest quality possible. Because nowadays it is, like back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, what would separate the men from the boys, quote unquote, would be how much gear you could afford to purchase, because you had to have racks of all this high-end audio processing tools in order to stand a chance of getting a professional quality result. This is no longer the case. Nowadays, you can, if you've got a reasonably modern laptop at your disposal or desktop computer, you can spend a couple $100s and have everything you need to get a very high quality sound captured. And if what you do with it, of course, is a whole other story, but that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So now what separates the men from the boys is your skills, is knowing how to manipulate the audio, knowing how to get the cleanest signal into your computer or your recording device, and knowing, of course, what to do with it once it's there, and once you have a screen full of tracks, how do you spread them around and create this illusion of three-dimensional space, which is really what makes for a great mix. And so we're going to get into that a little bit today. But the first thing I want to talk about is some of the mistakes that people make. And I think I got a slide for this. Yes, I do. The 4 biggest mistakes that will be a surefire indicator that you're a newbie. Okay? Okay, I guess the best way to do is just jump right into it. The first one is, and this is kind of obvious, and hopefully this doesn't need a great deal of explanation, is don't try to make a bad song sound good. You got to start from the source, okay? If your music isn't good, then fix that first. Because, like my mama used to say, you can't polish a turd, right? You can roll it in glitter a little bit, but it's still a turd at the end of the day, right? So start there. And again, I don't think I need to explain a great deal about that. That's just some common sense, but a lot of people forget about that. They think, I got a rough idea, let's record it. The recording will make it sound good. Well, it won't. The recording will not make it sound good. It's got to sound good to begin with, okay? The next thing is, of course, not being well rehearsed. Because again, if we want to have great tracks to mix, we've got to have great tracks coming into the computer or into the recording device, okay? And I encounter this a lot when I'm working with especially younger bands, younger musicians. They're all excited. They want to come in and record, which is great. I know how that feels. I love that experience as well. But if you're not well rehearsed, then you're not going to get good tracks captured. It's pure and simple, okay? And the other thing is that, and I have mixed opinions about this, is that if you come into the studio and you're not well rehearsed, that studio session turns into a really expensive practice session, rehearsal session, okay? Now, as the guy sitting in the chair drinking a coffee, watching the clock tick away, taking all your money, I don't really mind, but at the same time, I'd like to get down to business and make good music, okay? So make sure you got good music, make sure you're well rehearsed. The next thing is especially if you're recording yourself and you're producing your own project, is don't rush to get to the fun parts. And I've been guilty of this myself because I love mixing. That's the part of the production process that I enjoy the most. And so sometimes I'm guilty of, oh, that's good enough, well, let's get to the mix, let's get to that fun part. And at the detriment, of course, of the quality of the tracks that I'm getting into the system, into the computer, okay? So be careful not to be in a hurry to get to the part of the process that you like the most. And the next thing is not considering the big picture. And this is one that sort of took me a little longer to realize, and it kind of comes from experience. And that is, the more you record and you engage in these projects, and the more you finish, of course, you got to finish them in order to see the whole progression of events. And you'll start to see that the end result that you have, the product, let's call it, for lack of a better way of putting it, is a direct correlation to all of the preceding steps, right? So you need to make sure that when you're putting a mic in front of that guitar amp, for example, that you're thinking about where that guitar, what role that guitar is going to play in the mix. If it's going to be a featured role, if it's going to be an extra, so to speak, if it's going to be something on the side that just adds a little rhythm or what have you. These are the kind of things that will influence things like your mic choice or your mic placement or even the amp you choose to plug into or the guitar you pull off the wall. You might, if you're fortunate enough to have choices, right? You might have a tone in mind that is just perfect for what that guitar part is going to do, what its function is going to be in the mix. And of course, you need to make all of your decisions with that in mind. And again, this is something that sort of comes, the more experienced you become, the more projects you finish, the more you're going to start to realize what choices you need to make that happen. You know? And a big thing is that I think of a mix as a puzzle. It's a giant puzzle, an audio puzzle. And each element in the mix is a puzzle piece. And our goal is to, it's challenging because when you buy a puzzle, the puzzle pieces are already shaped. All you got to do is put them together. In a mix, in a production process, you're creating the pieces yourself. And so you've got to have that in the back of your mind, that this piece is going to fit right here, and so I need to shape it by my choices, by my EQ decisions, by my mic choices, by my mic placement even, in order to create a puzzle piece that's going to fit exactly where you want it to go, okay? So those, I would say, are the 4 biggest mistakes that people make in the beginning when they're just at the start of their learning curve. So just some food for thought. These are my cue cards, by the way, so I remember what I'm talking about. Yes, and as we kind of mentioned it, getting it right at the source is the solution to having an enjoyable mixing session. If you've got, I do a lot of mixing on the side, and a lot of times, especially nowadays, I'm mixing tracks that people have recorded, you know, in their bedroom studios, basement studios, or what have you. And of course, you have varying degrees of skill when it comes to the engineering process, and so I get all kinds of different quality levels of sessions to work with. And I found that you know, if I have a bunch of tracks that weren't necessarily recorded very well, maybe the levels are too low, and as I bring them up, I'm bringing the noise floor up with it, for example. These kinds of things make it very, very difficult for me to get a good mix. And it's unfortunate too because, I mean, I take it as far as I can, and then I give them the best result I'm capable of giving them. And if they listen to it and go, yeah, that doesn't sound like the radio, well, no, it doesn't, because I wasn't starting off with tracks that were professionally captured. And when I say professionally, I use the term loosely. I mean, all that means is you knew a little bit about what you were doing. You were able to get a high-quality sound captured, okay? So let's talk a little bit about that. This is, especially with digital recording, because we can do all of our processing after the fact, we can do all of our EQing, we can add our reverbs, our delays, all these things we can do after the track is recorded. It means that we're able to shorten what I refer to as your acquisition chain, okay? And that just simply means how we acquire the audio into the computer, okay? My recommendation, especially now, as I mentioned, you can do all your processing in post, is to keep your acquisition chain as short as possible so that there's fewer room for error, I guess, less room for error, for lack of a better way of putting it. So the most important things to consider when we're talking about your acquisition chain is your instrument, your source, your voice, your guitar, this type of thing. You want to make sure if you've got old dead strings on that acoustic guitar and it sounds like you're playing elastic bands, then there's no way you're going to get a good sounding track recorded. And it's kind of obvious, but you'd be amazed at how many people don't stop to consider the source. And they say, oh, maybe I got to buy a more expensive microphone. And that's fine. Come see me. I'll sell you one. But it's not that. It's the source. You got to make sure that if you're going to record drums, take a few minutes, go to the shop, buy some new heads if you haven't done so in a long time, slap them on, tune them up, and stretch them in, and get a good sounding instrument first. And then when you put a mic on it, it's a lot easier. You can just take a mic, put it in front of it, and it's going to sound more or less pretty good without even any mic technique or any knowledge of, for example, okay? The other thing to consider is the right microphone. Now, when it comes to microphones, I think of my microphone selection process as my first EQ decision. There's a couple of things. First of all, if you've got only one mic, then it's a real easy decision. you got only one mic. If you've got access to a few microphones, the way I look at my mic collection is I think of them as tone shapers. I think of them as EQs, basically. So if I'm trying to get a warm sound, and my instrument doesn't naturally have a warm sound, or I like to warm it up a little bit, then that's what I'm going to have in my mind when I look at my mic collection and I go to choose the right tool for the job. You'd be amazed, in fact, I unfortunately don't have it with me, but I have done some demos of A/B comparisons between microphones. And this is something that I recommend that you do. If you have a small collection of mics, something that you can do to really help learn your mic collection, because that's what it boils down to. You want to know what each mic's frequency characteristics are so that you can quickly reach for the right tool, okay? A good way to do that is to take each of your mics one at a time. If you're, whatever audio software you use, myself, I'm a Cubase user. Most modern DAWs, which is a digital audio workstation, will have a feature that has a tone generator in it. So if you've got a tone generator, put one on a track and have it play pink noise. Pink noise is just all the frequency spectrum, from low to high, played back at equal volume. It sounds like static, okay? But it gives you a full range frequency representation. Then take each one of your mics one at a time, place it right in front of the speaker, measure the distance so you have the same distance for every microphone, and record 10 seconds of pink noise on each microphone. And then repeat the process for all the mics that you have. Go through and make sure that your levels are all identical. If you've got to adjust the fader a little bit, make sure that they're all peaking at the exact same level, and then listen, mute and solo between those recordings, and you'll have a real clear picture as to the tonal characteristics of each one of your microphones. It's something that you can do in an hour or so when you have some downtime, if you ever do, unlike myself. And it's well worth it, because you can go through and listen and back and forth, and you can hear, okay, this microphone has a bit of a bump in the sort of nasally area of the frequency spectrum. This one's got a real bright sizzle on the top end. A lot of cheap mics have that. We call it the Chinese sizzle from all the imported microphones from the manufacturers in Asia. Yeah? Sure.
So once again, the pink noise, you generate the sound, and then where am I putting my microphone?
You put your mic right in front of the speaker that the pink noise is coming out of, and you record to the speaker, yeah, and then create an audio track and just record 10 seconds of that pink noise. The important thing is to try to control all the variables. So measure the same distance from the mic to the speaker for each microphone, and make sure all your levels are identical, okay? But this is going to give you a real good picture of what your mic collection, what you have in your mic collection, and how it's going to affect the tone of what you're trying to record. And then you can start to hear that some mics have like a harder sound, and some mics have a softer sound. And a general rule of thumb that I try to use is if I want to get a nice balance between the source and the microphone is, and this is kind of abstract, so hopefully you can kind of picture this in your head. But if I'm trying to record something, a source that I think has a hard sound to it, and again, it's very difficult to explain a sound, so hopefully you can get a mental image as to what that might mean. Let's say there's a hardness scale of, say, 0 or 1 to 10, right? I like to do the opposite with my mic choice. So if I've got a signal, a sound source that has, say, an 8 on the hardness scale, then I like to choose a microphone that has a 2 on the hardness scale. And that will typically balance out and give you a nice, clean, natural sound. Unless, of course, I'm going for an effect. If I'm trying to do something to the original sound, I'm trying to warm it up, or I'm trying to brighten it, or so on and so forth, okay? So that's just a little technique that you can use to help learn your mic collection, and I highly recommend it, because I have a lot of conversations here with folks, and they say, well, what's the best microphone for vocals? I don't know, your voice, my voice, a loud song, a soft song. It's really impossible to answer that question. The way you answer it for yourself is to understand what your microphones do to the sound, and then to understand what you want to do to the sound, and you put the two together, and the question answers itself magically, okay? So that's, yeah, like I say, that's a little food for thought on microphone choice. The next thing to consider when it comes to the microphone is your placement. And again, this is something that you'll have to experiment with, but you'll be amazed at how different the sound can be simply by angling the mic a little bit like this. It will change the frequency response of the sound. And so these are things, again, that you're going to want to play with and see when I'm on axis, in other words, the capsule is pointing directly at the sound source, how does that sound? Now, of course, if you did this measurement process with your microphones earlier, you probably, I recommend, just do record all the mics on axis, like pointing directly at the speaker that's generating the pink noise. But if you want to go a step further, shift it 45 degrees off axis and hear the difference, A-B the difference between on and off axis, and you'll get an even deeper insight and understanding about what your tools are going to do for you, okay? So mic choice, mic placement, those are the two things to consider only after you've got a great sounding source to begin with, okay?
Curious, they always say this, when you're singing, to sing directly into the mic, but you're saying that it is correct if you want different, even singing maybe? I'm not sure.
On anything, yeah. Ultimately, you'll get a different sound, absolutely. If you're on axis or off axis, you'll get a different sound. Now, one thing to consider, especially with a vocal, because a vocal, unless you're doing powerful operatic music or whatever, is not a very high sound pressure level source, not like a snare drum or a cranked up Marshall cabinet, right? So when you have a lower, a source that's of lower volume, then you have to remember that the rest of the room, the room to signal ratio is different. If you put something on a snare drum and you hit that snare good and hard, the microphone's going to hear this much snare, this much room. But if you whisper into a mic, the ratio changes, and now you're closer in volume to the ambient sound around you, okay? So in a vocal situation, if you put your mic off axis, you're automatically going to hear more room because you're reducing the direct signal approach to the capsule. Yeah, of course. If you're further away, more room is going to get into the signal. So if you want a big John Bonham drum room sound, you move your mics back, and hopefully you have a room that facilitates that sound, okay? All right, yes, okay. So we've got our source, we've got our mic. The next stage on our acquisition chain into the recording medium is your mic preamp or your DI box. What are you plugging into, in other words, okay? When it comes to your mic pre, the microphones have a very, very low electrical output. And so they need a preamplifier to bring the gain up to a level, to line level, so that the recording device can actually hear it, okay? That preamplifier is a critical stage in your acquisition chain. It has a dramatic effect on the quality of the sound. In fact, if you have, let's say you have 4 or 5 microphones already at your disposal, if you were to come and buy a high-end mic preamp, you have instantly upgraded the sound of your entire mic collection. So it's something to keep in the back of the mind. What you'll find with a cheaper mic pre is that where you can hear the quality of a preamp is at the upper gain stage, the upper range of its gain stage. So if you're using, say, dynamic microphones or ribbon microphones that have a very low output, as opposed to condenser microphones, which are hot, they're much hotter, then you need to, by default, you need to turn your preamp up louder in order to get a usable signal. And this is where you're really going to hear the quality, or lack thereof, of your microphone preamp. What happens is cheaper mic pre's have a noise floor, a little bit more of a noise floor. When you're at 40%, maybe even up to 50% of its gain stage, it's pretty negligible. You don't really hear the noise. But when you start getting at 60, 70, 80, 90% of the gain stage, that noise floor gets higher and higher, and it becomes audible. And when you solo a track, it might get buried in the mix a little bit, but again, our goal here is to get the highest quality audio into our recording device. And so this is one thing to consider. It's a little while ago, I bought a preamp called the Pre-73 from a company called Golden Age. And I recommend those to a lot of people that I speak with simply because it's solving this problem. It is a nice, very nice quality mic pre, but it doesn't cost what most nice quality mic pre's cost. I think they're $350, and normally you're into $1,000 and beyond for the good stuff. So me being a musician, and not a famous one, so my bank account reflects that, that was a great option for me. I was able to buy a stereo pair of those for less than half the cost of what it's modeling. It's modeling a Neve 1073, and without getting into the geeky details, Neve is, Rupert Neve is his name. He's a superstar in the audio industry, and every piece of gear he's ever designed is very sought after and very expensive. And these guys have sort of figured out a way to emulate that and get the price point down. It's called a Pre-73 from Golden Age. So that's one I recommend. And then, of course, it's a DI as well. If you're recording a bass or a guitar direct, and maybe you're going to do amp modeling after the fact, a good quality DI is a good place to go. Now, most microphone preamps also function as a DI, so you buy one thing, you've got both of those things covered, okay?
What about the mic preamps and the DIs built into the mixers?
Yeah, and totally usable as far as the stock stuff that's built into a mixer or built into your audio interface. Again, it's not until you get to the higher gain stages that you might discover that, okay, there's room for improvement.
Good enough to start, but one day you might want to get...
Absolutely, yeah. And that brings up a good point, because nowadays, even the cheap stuff is pretty darn good. I mean, you can buy a $100 audio interface, plug your microphone right into it, turn it up, and you're going to get a pretty good sound. So that's kind of convenient. You know, it makes it accessible to more and more people, which is fantastic as far as I'm concerned. But you'll start to notice as your ear develops, because that does happen, the more you do, you know, what I refer to as critical listening, which is what we do as mix engineers. It's all about nuances and learning to hear finer and finer details. Then as that ear develops, your hobby becomes more and more expensive. Let's put it that way, right? And so on the one hand, you want that ear to develop. On the other hand, you don't. You know, take your time to get there.
Just before you, maybe you'll touch on it, but microphone cables. Like you buy a cable for $20 or $200.
Yeah.
What advice would you give us?
I would say, I mean, this is a hotly debated topic. We're talking about cables and the quality of the cables. Myself, I say get a mid-range quality cable. You know you're going to have a decent sound. You know you're going to have a decent longevity, the life, right? Unless you're doing something where you're packing up and tearing down and setting up and this and that, like a live type of thing, you're going to want a real high-quality cable that's robust, just for the simple wear and tear. But I'll tell you what, unless you have an acoustic environment that's immaculate, you know, in terms of the treatment, and you have a monitoring system that's very, very honest and truthful, you're not going to hear the difference, in my opinion. Some people may debate that, but that's where I stand on that. So get some mid-range. Don't get the cheap bargain basement stuff, but you know, get a $20 mic cable or a $30 mic cable. Don't worry about the $150 one. I don't think it's... Well, he's asking about the length of the cable. I say the general rule of thumb is keep your acquisition chain as short as possible, but work with whatever your needs are. If you've got something that's 20 feet away, well, hey, you need a 20-foot cable, right? But I do like to, you know, keep it as short as possible. Less room for error, okay? And then what do we got next here? Oh, yes, all right. So we got our source, we got our mic, we've chosen it and positioned it, we've got our preamp, and the next thing, and this is the last thing in the acquisition chain, is your analog to digital converters. So at some point in the game, the sound in the room has to be turned into numbers, into ones and zeros, so that the computer can manipulate it. And that is another critical point along your acquisition chain. Now, AD converters, now by the way, they're built into your audio interface or your sound card or whatever it is that you're using. There's converters there. Depending on how high up the price ladder you climbed, will sort of give you an indication as to what quality they are. I will say, however, as important as converters are, they're probably the most subtle in terms of what you'll hear right away. If you go out and buy $2,000 Apogee converters, if you've got $2,000 to spend, go for it. It's certainly not going to hurt anything, but you might not be able to sit down right away and hear this amazing difference that your $2,000 has just bought you, okay? So I normally recommend when people are just building their studio and they're deciding what to spend their budget on, and you know, you've got X amount of dollars maybe every few months to put towards it, that I would normally consider that last. Just get something to get you started, and then later, again, as your ear gets more attuned to the nuances of things and the budget fills back up again, then we can start to consider upgrading your converters. And again, all the audiophiles and the audio snobs out there will say, no, you gotta have the best DACs in the world and this and that. Go for it if you've got the budget. But I think most of us, you know, it's a hobby. You know, we record a little bit on the side at home or whatever. I think your instrument, your microphone, and your preamp are much more important when you're getting started. The converter's a little more subtle, okay? Making sense so far? Okay, let's see. Oh yes, and then the last thing is your room itself. And this is the part that A, a lot of people don't stop to consider, and B, has a much bigger impact on the quality of your sound than a lot of people realize. Especially if you're trying to get a little bit of room sound As we talked about earlier, moving the mic a little bit away from the source, you get a bit more of a room sound, which can be attractive. It can make the puzzle piece fit a little nicer into the mix, right? But most of us don't have a beautifully treated room. You got a corner in the basement or a bedroom studio or whatnot. So this is sort of like the slide says, is the dragon we chase, right? It's the kind of thing that, again, after you've got that gear in place, got the acquisition chain happening, then you can turn your attention a little bit to the space that you're actually recording in. And it does make a big difference, not just from the recording end of things, but from once you've got your tracks recorded, where you're sitting and listening to the playback when you're making your mix decisions has a massive effect. This is something I wrestle with right now because my wife and I have been flipping houses, and now we're in a temporary living situation at my in-laws' place, and I don't have a studio per se. I have my gear on a table against the wall in the living room, kind of, right? So my acoustic environment leaves much to be desired. There's ways to get beyond that when it comes to mixing in particular, because mixing is just playback. We're not capturing any sound. You know, you can get some high-quality headphones. You can get, which takes the room out of the equation altogether. You can get there's a few products on the market now that will analyze your room and make, through the use of algorithms, computer algorithms, will make adjustments to your playback to compensate for the deficiencies in your room. A product called ARC by IK Multimedia does a good job of that, and there's also Ergo by KRK, a couple of different ones there. Yeah, no, it's not. It's not. Yes, got it.
You know what I'm saying? Like if the room has flaws, then this will adjust the flaws or add to it to make up for the flaws. Like singing, if you've got flaws in your pitch.
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Okay. So. Yeah. Okay, so if we're talking about room acoustics, a gentleman here is asking about putting up blankets and things like that. There's a lot of things you can do without breaking the bank. I'd say that the most important things, and bear in mind I'm not an acoustician, it's not my profession, but I've learned a few things along the way. And I found that the first thing to consider is what's referred to as your first order reflections. And so these are if you have sound coming out of your speakers, and you're sitting here, now you've got the direct signal coming to your ears, and the sound, though, spreads out in all directions. So where is the nearest surface that's reflecting the sound directly back to your ear? And that's what I refer to as, that's what's referred to as your first order reflections. So a good way to, and you treat those, by the way, just with some simple absorptive material. A heavy blanket, like a moving blanket. You get the acoustic foam, 2-inch or whatever, that works well. And a good way to figure out where to place it is if you're sitting in your mix position, there's a couple of spots. You want directly behind the speakers, the reflection points. And when I say directly behind, I don't mean speaker here, wall here, right behind. I mean the reflection point. And a good way to determine that is if you have someone to assist you, sit down in your mix position and have someone hold a mirror against the wall and have them move it until you can see the back of your monitor, your speaker, in the mirror. That's the reflection point. So you would put some treatment there and the same on the other side. The second place is on the walls to either side of you, because you're going to get direct reflections back this way, and that's just straight out to the left and the right. The third, which a lot of people forget about, is directly above you. So you can take a bit, maybe a 1.5 meters square or whatever, and suspend it from the ceiling in some fashion, and that's going to get the reflection points from directly above. Those are the places I like to begin with. And right there, it's going to have a noticeable difference. If you do a little bit of maybe a little recording, put a measurement mic or something real flat, record a little sample, then put up the treatment, record it again, you'll hear the difference with an untrained ear even. It's very obvious.
Remember Dark Side of the Moon where the guy running behind, is that just mix at the mix point where the guy runs from here behind?
No, that's a whole other technique. We may talk about that, I don't know.
So the reflection up, you're talking about Dezz in the ceiling too, you talking the same type of thing, right, where a mirror would kind of catch that speaker? Or
Just directly above you.
just above you?
Directly above you, yeah. Yeah, and you know, of course, you have to work within the limitations of what you're able to do in your home. If you rent, if you live with somebody, you know, these kind of things you'll have to consider. But yeah, that's where I would start, is those first order reflection points.
So you're trying to eliminate any kind of bouncing back to your ear?
That's right. Yeah, because what happens is the direct signal will come from the speaker monitor and to your ear, and then a split second later, the reflection will reach your ear. And the timing difference between the two arrivals will cause phase cancellation. So without getting too scientific, you've got a sine wave that's doing this, and like general wave theory that you learn in high school physics, if you've got two sine waves that are going equal and opposite from one another, then they will cancel each other out and create complete silence. So what's going to happen is certain frequencies in the signal will be 180 degrees out of phase with one another, and they'll disappear. And so you'll get this comb filtering where certain frequencies dip right out to zero, and then there's the rest of the sound, and then there's another dip, and they call that a comb filter, right? So this is what's going to happen. And the problem with that is that you're making your decisions as a mixer based on what you hear. There's nothing else you can do. And if what you're hearing is not truthful, then you're an honest representation of the audio, then you're making all the wrong decisions, essentially. And you're going to mix this thing to perfection. It's going to sound amazing. You're going to have people come down, hit play. Everyone's like, this is awesome. You're going to burn a disc and put it in the car, and it sounds like crap again. Because now the room, the monitoring situation is no longer there supporting your decisions. And that's the idea. And that's the reason why we struggle so hard as time goes on to improve the accuracy of our room. Okay? Well, like I say, the gentleman's asking about if you're recording yourself at home, just a mic and an amp or whatever, do you need to put some blankets out and this and that? And really it depends on, because the blankets are not for isolation, right? It's like if you're trying to isolate two different sources so that the microphones don't pick each other up, right? That's one thing. It's not for isolation, it's for control of what the microphone is actually hearing in terms of the room. So if it makes the sound better, then yes, essentially, that's as mediocre a response as that is. That's really how you decide. Yeah, if you need to absorb reflections, if there's too much room, if it sounds too reverberant, then you go ahead and you take measures to reduce that by absorbing some of those reflections. Okay. Oh yes, and then don't forget, perform well, right? You know, hit the right notes in the right order at the right time with the right emotion behind them. Yeah, if need be. Okay, and again, of course, none of this means anything if you don't start with a good song, okay? So this is really, what we just spoke about there for the last few minutes is all there is to getting the highest quality sound into your session so that you can start mixing and have a good time doing it and get to the final result much quicker, okay? So again, good source, good microphone, good cables maybe, right? Great preamp, great converters from analog to digital. Once you're past the converters, there's no way you can go wrong. You cannot lose quality anymore. You can make inappropriate decisions, right? You can screw things up by your EQing choices and so on and so forth, but you can't actually lose any quality, okay? And especially if you're not going to mix your own track, if you're going to send it to somewhere else, then they're going to have everything they need in the highest quality possible to do their job, okay? So, what comes next? Oh yes. We're not quite there yet. So let's assume now we've got a screen full of high-quality audio files. We've got drum mics, we've got guitars, we've got vocals, and so on and so forth. The next thing to getting yourself prepared to mix is to go through the editing process, which is my least favorite part of the music production process. So much so that I have a separate price if the tracks need editing. That's a whole other job. I'll edit and you pay me for that. Then we'll talk mixing, okay? Because it is kind of tedious, especially if it's not my own music. I don't get that gratifying feeling of hearing the final result. It's basically the corrections of errors. That's all we're talking about when we're talking editing. So that could be rhythmic errors, that could be pitch errors like you're talking about. It could be audio anomalies, like maybe someone hit the mic stand or someone's phone made a noise or whatever. We're basically trying to remove all the errors at this point so that we take those beautiful tracks that we've recorded and make them even more beautiful. That's the idea. So the first step to getting your session ready is to commit, I call it commit and convert. And that is, nowadays, and this wasn't the case in the past, but nowadays, we use a lot of software for our actual sounds. We're not always making sound in the air and capturing it with a microphone. Sometimes we're using VST software instruments. Sometimes we're using amp modeling software. Plug your guitar right in, and on the screen you pull up the amp and the pedals and all the dials and everything that you want, and that's the sound you get, right? So my recommendation is, and there is some debate on this as well, but my recommendation is to draw a line in the dirt that says this was the recording / arranging process, and it's now done. And now we're going to begin the mixing process. And this is a bit of a brain hack that I found to be very, very helpful. It helps me to sort of reset my mind and focus on what my next goal is, which is to take this collection of audio events and turn them into a nice three-dimensional sound stage that has some emotion and so forth, okay? So, and I like to do that by making sure that I have, when I'm getting ready to mix, I have nothing on the screen except audio files. Just 24-bit, high bit depth, nice, clean audio files. So I don't want to have MIDI tracks running instruments. I don't want to have my amp modeler still active, because when you use amp modeling, you're recording your guitar clean. That's the actual sound you recorded, and then the software is turning it into the tone that you want, right? So there's two problems. One is that, well, actually, the one biggest problem is that those processes are taking away the resources from your computer that you might need later as you start adding plugins and automation and all kinds of fun stuff into your session. So some of these VST instruments and modelers are very, very resource hungry. So your CPU is working harder than it needs to. Your RAM memory is being all used up by these sample-based instruments and so forth. And so that's the big thing. When we take those VST instruments and export them as audio tracks, make sure, edit them first if there's any errors that need to be fixed, export them as an audio track, bring them back into your session, and turn off the plugin. And maybe put that track in a backup folder in case you want to revisit it later, but turn off the plugin, and now you've just freed up some system resource. And the other thing is that it forces you to make a commitment. And this is something, especially a lot of the younger engineers nowadays, because especially with powerful computers, you don't need to make a commitment. It's like, I'll pull up a sound and I'll put a part in, maybe I'll change it later, I'm not sure. It's like, you gotta make a commitment that this is the sound that's going to fit in this mix, and like you had to do in the older days. You pick a guitar, you plug it in, you set your amp just right, you put a microphone in front of it, you position it just right, you hit record, you're committed, it's on tape, right? And this, I find, again, it's a psychological thing, it's a bit of a brain hack, but it just allows me to separate that process is done, this is what I've got to work with. Now, of course, I back up those tracks, so if worse came to worse, I could go back, pull up that direct guitar again, pick a new amp tone or whatever, and then print it again and turn off the plugin and commit to that sound, okay? So that's the first thing, is take your VST instruments, take your amp modelers, convert them to audio just by exporting them, solo the track, export, bring it back into the project, turn the rest off.
So
okay.
You're saying, like, if you want a guitar and you want some flange or chorus or something, it's better to use your pedal in advance, get your sound that you want, not using the software to do an amp modeling.
That's a good question, yeah. So the gentleman's asking, it's like if you want a flanger or something on your guitar, am I suggesting that you do that with your guitar tone, commit it, and convert it to audio instead of experimenting with the flange later on after the guitar is recorded? And I would say that depends. Most of the time, when I record a guitar player, I'm trying to capture the sound of how they play that song. So if they use a flanger or whatever, then I'm going to record it that way. Even if you're using amp modeling, because you can get little MIDI control pedals, you can turn your effects on and off and whatever. I'm trying to capture that player. So my philosophy is record it the way the player intends it to sound, commit that to audio, and then carry on. So now afterwards, I might still tweak it with some EQ and compression and maybe throw it to a reverb or something, but I've captured the guitarist's sound. And that's the way I would look at it. Let's see, what are we at here? Oh yeah, so we talked about this, convert all VST instruments into audio tracks, print all amp models and import them as audio files, back up and disengage your plugins, and there's the line in the sand. Now we're kind of ready to begin tweaking up those tracks and getting ready to mix, okay? So this is the final step, and as I mentioned, I'm going to breeze through some of this, but this is the part I hate the most. what I recommend you do is listen to every track or every group of tracks. If you've got the time and the inclination, listen to every individual track from beginning to end and listen for errors. And what you're listening for are things like plosives, peepops, or things like maybe some noise the vocalist was singing and then in between lyrics, clearing their throat or anything like that. I like to go through and remove all of those things so that I end up with nothing but the audio that I actually want in my mix session, okay? Listen for sibilants, excessive S and T sounds, and try to reduce those. If it's just one really bad one, just actually notch it out manually, you know, or turn the volume down, chop, chop, and turn the volume down on that one little transient or whatnot. If it's something that's consistent, then we'll use tools like a de-esser or something like that in the mix to do that kind of for us. But in this phase, we're just listening for glaring things that we don't want in the audio, okay? And then here, quite important, is that you need to make a decision if this mix is supposed to be really polished, like a pop tune, or a bit more organic, like, you know, a Delta blues or a bluegrass number or something like that. And that's going to influence how far you go with these other stages. If you want a really polished production, then you find everything in every track and you clean it up to the best of your ability. Otherwise, you can let some errors go. Sometimes a little bit of that natural human error is nice, depending on the music. So that's a decision you'll have to make up front before you consider the editing process. Okay. The next thing is to proceed with your rhythmic edit. So that's to tighten everything up. Once again, depending on how polished or not, right? So you can go through, nowadays there's some amazing tools in our software that can actually warp and stretch audio. So if a guitar player came a little bit late on that first beat, you can actually grab it and stretch it over so it's right on the beat and all the power comes at the same time. Same thing with drums. You can do multi-track drum editing now in some software, which is fantastic. You can take 10 microphones, tell the computer to treat them as one track and move them all around so that the drummer is perfectly in the pocket. These are, as far as I'm concerned, amazing things that we can do nowadays that we could never do before. So again, just decide on how tight and perfect you want it, because sometimes you want it to be a little more human. You want a little bit of, you know, push and pull and so on. Maybe a little bit of tuning fluctuation in the vocal, you know, has a more emotional impact or whatnot. So you got to make that determination first. Yeah.
Can you apply this multi-track editing to analog drums? Is that what you
Yes. Yeah, I'll do a video about that sometime. It's pretty amazing. And then the last thing, tune your vocals. If, again, to the degree that's appropriate for the presentation you're trying to put together. At that point, you have beautiful tracks all the way into the computer, beautifully edited, nothing but audio files on the screen, all your plugins are closed, and then we're pretty much ready to mix. Now this is where I like to start. So, well, you can use software now like Melodyne or Auto-Tune. If you're a Cubase user, there's Very Audio built in, and so you can take any sharp or flat, pitchy parts and just tweak them into tune a little bit. And again, only if it's offensive to the ear, because sometimes a little tuning fluctuation is totally acceptable. But that's basically it. Yeah. So tune your vocals and do your rhythmic edits, and you're good to go. Okay. And this is where we start. So this is, like I said, this is my favorite part. And one of the things that I learned a few years back that I found had the biggest impact in the quality of my mixes is what mixing actually is. Okay? And as funny as that might sound, because I know a lot of you probably, if you're anything like me, I mean, we kind of listen and we make an adjustment and we decide, did that sound better or worse? And if it sounded better, we move along to another thing and we tweak that. Did that sound better or worse? Okay, I think it sounds a little worse. Okay, undo that. Let's try something else. That sounds a little better. And we're moving around in circles this way and that way, blindly in the dark, hoping that we end up with a good mix at the end of the day, right? And of course, you got to start somewhere. This is how we learn. This is how you train your ear and so on and so forth. But it was brought to my attention one day that what mixing actually is, what we're trying to do is to systematically distribute the elements, the audio elements of your arrangement, but amongst the three spatial dimensions that exist between the speakers. And even though there's only two speakers, there's this thing that we call psychoacoustics that will trick the mind into hearing a three-dimensional space. And that's really the goal in the beginning of setting up what I call your static mix. And that's the mix as good as it can possibly sound without anything moving yet. And we'll talk about that in a second, okay? So again, the goal is distribute all of the elements evenly and in a balanced way amongst the 3 spatial dimensions, okay? And then the second thing is to add emotional impact to the musical experience by using automation to make things move and to breathe life into the track and to sort of highlight things that you need to highlight for this particular instance and bring them to the background again when they're no longer the feature and add that movement and life into the tune. That's it. Those are the 2 things that we're trying to accomplish when it comes to mixing, okay? So let's talk a little bit then about 3-dimensional mixing, which I love these little animations. The secret to great mixes. Okay, first thing is the vertical dimension. The vertical dimension is probably the least intuitive. Does anyone, any idea what we do to audio to make it seem higher or lower? Any guesses? Sorry?
Frequency?
Yeah, exactly. Frequency. So the vertical dimension is, let me see, yes, frequency distribution. And it's like if you hear like a shrill violin tone, you hear that up here. If someone hits a big 24-inch kick drum, you hear that down here, like you can feel it down here. And that's how you create the illusion of vertical placement. So, this is just, again, something to consider in your strategy when you're putting when you're designing your mix and how you want it to flow. That's your horizontal dimension. We'll get to that. This is your vertical dimension we're talking about. So from floor to ceiling, okay? And like I say, it's based on how you distribute the frequencies. Obviously, your bass guitar and your kick drum are filling in the bottom. Your electric guitars and organs are somewhere in the middle. Your cymbals are up top here. The breathy part of your voice and the zing from fresh strings on a guitar, they're up at the top here as well.
I never realized, I've always thought of frequency of how I hear it, like the tone highs and lows. I didn't realize actually how you feel it.
That's right.
You feel like the low tones here.
Yeah, and you felt it before. And that creates the illusion of vertical placement. Okay, so the primary tool we use to place something along the vertical dimension, of course, is your EQ, because that's how we manipulate the frequency content of the audio element, okay? So you can use the EQ to help sit something a little nicer or a little tighter or a little more accurately along that vertical dimension, okay? And the idea here is also to carve the elements of your mix so that you avoid frequency competition and what's called masking. And masking is another psychoacoustic phenomenon that happens when 2 sound sources share very similar frequency space and they're played back simultaneously. They tend to become a blur, like there's no definition between the parts anymore. They mask one another out. And so this is one of the big things to consider when you're in this first phase of the mix, which is designing that vertical spectrum, okay? Making sense so far?
How important is considering that when you're trying to record the tracks in the first place?
100% important. And again, as you do this more and more and more, you're going to realize you're going to use this goal to influence your decisions on mic choice, on string choice, on mic placement, on amp settings, because you're trying to position that instrument into your mix somewhere. And so again, the more experience you have with this, the more of these decisions you'll be making earlier and earlier in the process. Yeah, okay, so that's pretty much the vertical dimension.
Dezz, you never mentioned the competing side. How did they compete against each other?
Well, competition is just if there's 2 sound sources that share the very, very similar frequency spectrum, then they naturally compete with each other. That's just, there's not much better way I can explain that. Yeah, or like your kick drum and your bass line. They both live down in the low frequencies. And what happens a lot of times, and the low end is oftentimes the most difficult for people, partly because the low frequencies have such a high energy and they take up all your headroom, but also because most people's acoustic environments don't give a truthful representation of the low end. And so it becomes really difficult to make those decisions. But your bass line and your kick drum, you might notice a nice fat bass, and then every time the kick hits, it's just bleh, bleh, and there's no definition, and that's because they're competing, they're masking one another out. So you could carve those elements with your EQ. You could say, okay, I want the kick drum to have this part of that low frequency, and I want the bass to fill in that part. And then you use your EQ to sort of carve those pieces so that they work a little more harmoniously together, okay? And those are the rough decisions that you would make when you're considering that vertical dimension. Okay, the other thing, 3 dimensional mixing. Well, competition is just if there's 2 sound sources that share the very, very similar frequency space and they're played back simultaneously. They tend to become a blur, like there's no definition between the parts anymore. They mask one another out. So you could Horizontal dimension, this is a simple one. Panning, left and right. Everybody here has used a pan pot at some point or another. So it doesn't take as much explanation. This is the obvious one. You want something over here, you twist it. You want something over here, you twist it the other way. Very simple, okay? But one thing, pan pot is the primary tool. And the one thing we're trying to do here is to help reinforce the decisions we made in the first step. So if we've got two instruments that inhabit a similar area of the frequency spectrum, but we don't want to sacrifice the sound of those instruments, we can help them sit better in the mix by putting them on opposite sides. And now they're not going to mask each other so much. They're going to still have definition in the mix because although they inhabit the same vertical space, we've now separated them on the horizontal plane, okay? So that's really the thing to consider. It's real simple. There's not much to know about panning except for what you're actually trying to do. And what you're trying to do is create a space for everything in the mix so that everything plays back and can be heard with the maximum impact of whatever is appropriate for the session, okay? So the next thing is your depth dimension. And the depth dimension is I call it the tricky one because it is a little less obvious. I mean, vertical, high frequency, low frequency, simple. Panning, left, right, simple. With depth, it's a little bit more magic, you know. What you're trying to do is you're trying to use reverbs and delays, which are referred to as ambient effects, to create the psychoacoustic illusion that there's depth in your mix, okay? And a good thing to think about when it comes to this is, okay, well, let's start by talking about how the actual auditory system works. When you hear, if you close your eyes in a room, you can hear pretty accurately what direction something's coming from, roughly how far away it is. You know, you might not be precise, but you get a rough idea how far away a sound is. Also, you get a rough idea as to how big the space is that you're standing in when you hear that sound. Those are the things to consider. So I want something to sound like it's 10 feet away, but I want it to sound like it's 10 feet away in a 100-foot room, or 10 feet away in a 15-foot room. Sounds totally different, right? So these are the illusions we're trying to recreate when it comes to our ambient effects. So let me see, what's the next slide say? Oh yeah, so EQ and compression are also involved, by the way. I'll explain how that works. Basically, think about this for a second. As sound travels through the air, it loses energy, just like anything. It loses energy, and slowly certain frequencies begin to disappear by the time they get to your ear. Now, high frequencies lose energy the quickest. So it's the exact reason why a foghorn out on the ocean is a low bassy tone, because it stands the best chance of being heard at the farthest distance. If they blew a whistle, you'd hear it 20 feet away and then it's gone, right? So low frequencies will travel to your ear from a much further distance than high frequencies. So you can use this knowledge to create an illusion that something is further away by rolling off a little of the high frequencies with your EQ, because physically those frequencies would not reach your ear if indeed the sound source was that far away, okay? And that's one way that EQ can come into play. The other thing is that the further something is away, the more the ratio, like we spoke about earlier, of the signal to the ambience, the signal to the room, the more that balances out. So if you want something to appear further away, you can send it to a reverb unit that's going to create the illusion that there's more room and less signal, which gives us that impression that something is further away, okay? So we want to push something back, we send it to the EQ, or excuse me, to the reverb a little bit, and then we roll off some of those high frequencies because those are the things that would not have reached us by the time the sound covers that distance, okay? And the other thing is compression. And this was one that I don't remember where I learned this, but it was a revelation to me, and that is what compressing an audio signal is actually doing is, for those of you who don't know, is you set a threshold and you say, the audio shall not pass this threshold, or maybe it will pass a little bit, but it starts to turn down. And this is depending on how you set your compressor controls. And I don't want to get into that right now. It's beyond the scope of this conversation. But what's happening is the audio signal goes above the threshold, the compressor turns it down, and then we typically have a makeup gain stage that turns the whole signal back up again so that we don't lose any volume. So it's that last stage, that makeup gain stage, where the psychoacoustic magic happens. And that is that because we've turned the levels down, the peaks down, what we've done is we've made them closer to the low-level signals. So now the dynamic range is smaller. So in other words, when we make up gain and bring everything back up to the top, what we've essentially done is kept the loud sounds exactly where they were, but made the quiet sounds louder. And of course, if the breathy part of your voice is 20 feet away, you're not going to hear it. But if we compress it and bring the breathy parts, the low-level parts, up closer to the high peaks, bring the whole thing back up, we've created the illusion that there's intimacy, there's a closeness there, because I can hear every smack of your lip or whatever on the microphone. So that's another way that you can further solidify the idea of that closeness or depth if you do the opposite.
Yes, first off, this is fantastic. Thank you.
No problem.
And with the vocal, you're saying like how from an EQ point of view, what would you do to it to give the breathy, lower bassy stuff to sound like it's more intimate, like you just said?
Okay, so
I'm a little more technical, of course, but just if you were to give us 10 seconds.
So the first thing is it depends on the track and how it sounds to begin with, of course, right? But if you want, the question is how do we make a vocal sound closer and a little more intimate? So the way I would do it is this, based on what we've just spoken about, is first of all, I wouldn't send it to the reverb, or I would send very, very little of it to the reverb. Second of all, I might actually enhance some of the upper frequencies, because again, the opposite has the effect of distancing the sound. And then I'm going to apply compression to bring those low-level signals, the breathy parts, up. And that automatically is going to make the vocal sound right here in your face. Do the exact opposite, and you start to push it back a little bit. And so when you're planning your arrangement, you take all these things into consideration. I've got my lead vocal here. I want the backup vocal to sound like they're there. And so you make your decisions according to your strategy, right? There was a question back here. It would be, yeah. You would say that, at minus 6 dB is the threshold, so anything that goes above that gets turned down. And that's generally how a compressor works. Yeah.
So if you want music with a lot of dynamics,
Yeah.
you would not compress too much? Is that correct?
That's correct, because compression automatically reduces the dynamic range. So if you want a dynamic mix, like a jazz record, jazz trio playing acoustic instruments or something, not a lot of compression used typically in those sessions. It's interesting, if you hear a modern jazz, like a fusion kind of band, that has a modern style and a modern production approach, it's obvious from the first couple notes, because it doesn't have that organic, natural depth of... Yeah, exactly. You have more control that way, but it's a different sound. So again, you use your creative taste and you decide which method you want to apply. Okay, so that pretty much covers the 3 basic dimensions. Is that kind of making sense to everybody? On the same page? All right. Okay, so with a bit of an understanding of how that works, the next thing we can do is actually plan out a mix. And this is something that again, when I first sort of started exploring with these concepts, that I used to do a lot, which is actually grab a pencil and a paper and look at my session and decide where I'm going to put everything. Like I actually mix the tune on paper or in my head first, and then I go to my tools and I make it happen. And this is something I recommend you try doing if you haven't already done so. So in this particular session, we have, okay, what I got here in the green is what I call the sacred center. The center of that mix is like where the most important elements go, the features, the vocal, if it's an instrumental tune, the soloist, if it's a fiddle or something like that. A lot of times, the low frequency elements, the kick drum and the bass drum, also go down the middle. And that's for a slightly different reason. The reason why we put those low-end instruments in the middle is because you want, for bass frequencies, high energy frequencies, you want the drivers of the speakers to be moving in sync with one another. And that's why there's plugins that will actually say, take any frequency below 80 hertz and make it mono, force it into mono, so that your speakers are driving at the exact same time when it comes to those bottom end frequencies. You get a better sound and you avoid phase issues, phase cancellation. And that's, again, I won't go too deeply into that, but that's the reason why we put the kick and the bass in the sacred center. This tune also had a steel guitar solo in it, so when the solo came, it got featured front and center. And the snare drum is oftentimes placed in the sacred center as well, because it's one of the driving rhythmic elements. And you want that to be, predominant in most cases, okay? And the other thing is most of the time your overheads on your drum kit have the snare sounding like it's in the middle, and so you don't want to skew that by having this direct snare mic away from where the overheads hear it. You want to match those up, okay?
That's in the screen box for you. Like what parameters do you use to define the boundaries of the screen box when you're talking about frequency? Or is that,
Well, this is
how you draw it?
when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about panning.
Panning.
Yeah, so I'm saying this is the center of the mix, right? And of course, I've got these in the center, so I'm gonna make sure I use my EQ decisions vertically to make sure that they don't overlap each other too much, so they stack nicely in the center, right?
You said all inside the green lines there is mono?
I pan it right to the center, yeah, exactly. So essentially mono, yes, okay? And then again here in this particular example, I've got this acoustic guitar. I want it to be somewhat close to the listener and off to the side. Same with the fuzz guitar, electric guitar on the right. I've got my backup vocals. Again, the main vocal is right up here. I've got my backup vocals pushed back a little bit and spread out a little bit to the sides. And my toms making up my drum kit here, making some stereo spread. My electric guitars, I had them pushed a little bit further back yet. Because in this particular mix, they were there to add some grit and color and energy, but they weren't a feature. It was really an acoustic tune that this particular session was, and that's why they were placed the way that they are there. And then I had the other background vocals placed even further back in the mix to create, when I solo the vocal group, to create a real dense space. So I got the lead vocalist right here, got some companion backup vocalists right there, and then a couple more back there, so it sounds more like a party, like a gang vocal group singing, okay? I had my room mics panned out, and I had some claps that happened in the choruses, and they were pushed way to the back, because I wanted it to sound like there's just people in the back having a good time clapping away to this tune, but they're not in the mix. They're not a feature of this particular arrangement. They're there more to serve as like, in marketing we call it social proof. People are having fun, so it must be good, right? So that's an example of a strategy, a mix strategy that I put together for a session. And I recommend the practice, like to try that out a few times. Mix the song in your head, like or on paper first, and then see how closely you can represent that with the actual audio, okay? And that's how I approach that. What do we got next? I went that way already. Let's go the other way. Oh, yes. Okay. So by this point, if you have a good understanding of the 3 dimensions, a good understanding of the way you use your tools to manipulate the elements within those dimensions, and you've planned out your mix, and then you've applied it, and now you should be hearing something that sounds really, really good, because we've got the best quality audio into the computer, we've edited it to the degree of perfection that's appropriate for the tune, we've tuned all our vocals and everything, so the quality is great, and now we've created this 3-dimensional sound stage by placing these elements amongst these 3D planes, right? That's what I call your static mix. That's the point where a lot of people walk away and say, it's done, it sounds great. And that's fine, and oftentimes it does sound great. But there's this whole extra layer that we can get into when we start to consider automation. So when it comes to automation, what we're talking about is, and we can do this now with software very easily. Back in the day, you'd have to have a $500,000 console that had automated motorized faders. A little further back in the day, you'd have to have a team of people sitting at the board, say, record, and everyone's moving the faders, dancing the tune around to get an automated mix to tape, right? Nowadays, we got $100 on software, and you can do all of this stuff, no problem, right? So what we do is we do things like we automate our faders, the levels of the tracks. A primary example is vocal riding, where you want your vocal, because oftentimes, 95% of the time or more, the vocal is the star of the show. The vocal is the feature. So you want to make sure the vocal can always be heard over and above the mix, especially if it's a real lyrical piece. You want people to be able to know the lyrics so that it sticks in their head and they catch themselves singing it and whatever, and this is how you get a catchy tune that hopefully someone will eventually pay you for. So that's an example. So what I would do is I would go through and, with a critical ear, and I'd say, okay, at this point, this guitar kicks in the chorus, and now it's kind of masking the vocal, so I'm going to automate the fader to ride up there. And I think of it like, if you've ever gone fishing with a bobber, and you know, the water's moving all around like this, but the bobber always stays on top of the water. That's what I'm trying to achieve normally with my vocal.
Isn't that actually preferred over compression sometimes?
Absolutely, yeah. Because again, compression changes the characteristics of the sound. All we're doing now is making sure it stays audible, right? So if you use compression, that will sort of give you the effect of keeping a consistent vocal, but it's also changing the actual character of the sound. It's changing the perception of depth, and it's changing, you know, like sometimes there's lower level signals that, like lip smacking and stuff that you don't want to be right in the listener's ear. So in which case you use automation instead, yeah. So let me see, what do I got next here? Okay, yeah, so like I say, the first thing we do is we automate for clarity, so make sure we can hear the elements. And when I'm talking automation too, the vocal riding is sort of like it's a large, heavy-handed thing. But I'm talking about some of the finer details, like the nuances. For example, let's say there's a particular lyrical passage that was recorded, and one syllable that is important to the comprehension of the word that's being said is a little buried. So I might go in and automate just that one syllable to come up in volume a little bit so that the word can be understood more clearly, as an example, right? So you can do these things on the nuances of the music as well. You can automate like literally anything now in the software. For example, let's say, again, vocals is a good thing to talk about because I spend a lot of time on automation on vocals. Sometimes, for example, there's maybe one word at the end of a phrase that has a little emotion to it or something, and I want to accentuate that in my mix. I might automate my compressor to do what we were talking about earlier. I might automate my compression settings to make that vocal sound right up intimate on that, just that one word, you know, especially, you know, you can think of like a, you know, smoky voice female jazz singer doing a little number, and there's that one lyric that's just, you know, emotional, and you want to get that right up in the listener's ear. Well, I might automate multiple things to achieve that. I might automate the panning, I might automate the EQ curve, and I might automate the compression settings and the reverb send levels to make that particular syllable do what I want it to do, for example, right?
Now, coming back to vocal, say certain sections you want to add, say, an effect, or say like there's a word that you want to stress on and you want just that word to sound like it's coming from the top of a mountain or whatever.
Yeah.
At what phase would you do that? Would that be right in the beginning? Would you convert everything into audio tracks when you add your effects? Or?
I typically do that kind of stuff in this stage of the process, after I've got my static mix together. So if and a good way to do that, what you're describing, is through what's referred to as a delay throw, for example. So maybe I want that one word at the end of the phrase to echo a little, right? So I can have a delay set up on an effects channel, and I can automate my send level so that just at that precise point in the song, the send level opens up and sends the vocal to the delay and then turns off again. And so the delay goes on a little bit, but just on that one word. Yeah, you'd have an effects bus with a delay on it, and then you'd send your vocal to that delay just for a second, and then turn it off again, and the delay would... What's that?
Is that the time parameter you would use to send and return, or is it based on bars, or how?
Yeah, it's based on the... Yeah, it's a timing thing. So at exactly this point in time in the tune, I want to open up the send to my delay, and then immediately close it again at the end of that word. So only that one word repeats in the delay, for example, right? So that's one thing, automate for clarity. The other thing is to automate for energy. And so you might automate more like large portions of your mix. For example, let's say you've got 18 tracks of just the drum kit, overheads and room mics and this and that and the other, right? I might take all of those drum mics and I might automate them up a dB or two in the chorus, for example. It's something that it's a commonly used little trick, because that slight bump in volume of the drums, or maybe even just the snare drum or whatever, you have to sort of use your own decision making there. But what that does is it's subtle, it's not obvious. The listener doesn't go, oh, the drums are all of a sudden louder, because you don't do it to that degree. But what it does is it gives the impression that there's more energy in this part, that we've just moved from a mellower part and now we've got some energy. So that's an example of how you might use automation to create energy in your mix. And that has to do with contrast. So if one section of the tune was such and such, if we do a slight bump here and there to certain elements of our mix, there's a contrast between those two now. Of course, without the contrast, you don't have the experience of more energy. It's just that's the way it sounded all the way through. It's the contrast between the sections that we manipulate through automation that will create this effect. Okay. And then the last thing is automate for emotion, and we kind of spoke about that a little bit already. With the smoky jazz lounge singer or whatever. If we want to get that, that level of intimacy up or what have you, right? So that, and honestly speaking, I can spend 80% of my time on this phase. Get the static mix together, especially if the tracks were given to me well recorded like we spoke about in the beginning, and I can get my static mix together and push things around this way and that way and plan out my 3D strategy, and then I'll spend the 80% of the time doing this, all the subtle details that dial it in, put my fingerprint on this particular mix. And that's how, when you hear great mix engineers talk about other great mix engineers, I used to never understand it. It's like, oh, this mix is so amazing, blah, blah, blah. I get it now. It's those little details. It's like, I would never have thought to do that. It's hard when you haven't heard the original tracks, but if you hear something that's unmixed, and then you hear something that's mixed, now you can hear what the mixer did, right? And I got actually a couple tracks I want to play for you in a second. But that is essentially, in a nutshell, everything needed to get great mixes, to get a great end result that's going to travel and sound good on any player, any system that you play it on, and it will also hopefully help you get paid if you do this for other people.
This automation part, is this a part of, like, say, Cubase, or is this an extra software?
No. Any major DAW, like Cubase, Pro Tools, Logic, has automation built in. It's a standard thing nowadays. It's one of the reasons why I have such a hard time selling people hardware recording devices. I just feel bad about it because buy this box for $500 that can do 1% of what you can do with this box on your laptop for $150, right? So yeah, it's standard feature. Even the free versions of these recording software applications, no problem. You can automate almost any parameter in your mix, okay? So that is more or less what I wanted to chat with you guys about today. Do we got questions?